Hi there, good afternoon. So today I'm going to talk through how I would go about answering a past A-level history coursework question. The title reads, as on the screen, in the context of the period 1865 to 1968, to what extent was the Brown decision of 1954 the most significant turning point in the advancement of African American rights? So I'm going to show you how I'd go about planning an answer to this sort of question to meet all the marking criteria. And particularly today, I'll focus on how to best conduct a comparative evaluation, such as this type of question requires, and also how to integrate some historiographical analysis into this type of question to pick up those extra marks. So, just to start, obviously, this question focuses on the Brown decision. That was, of course, the seminal Supreme Court ruling that ruled that the separate but equal doctrine in public schools was unconstitutional. But obviously this kind of question requires some comparison with other key events in African American advancement of civil rights. So some events I think would provide some good scope for comparison and analysis are those which I've listed on the screen here. So just to briefly go through them, the amendments, respectively, they gave African Americans freedom from slavery, the US citizenship, and voting rights. And I think this could provide some good comparison and evaluation with Brown v. Board. On the one hand, you could argue that without the amendments, you don't have the constitutional grounding for the decision in Brown. And so arguably, therefore, the amendments are the greater turning point, the more significant turning point. Or alternatively, you could argue the sort of reverse, which would be that the Brown decision reversed or overruled a fundamental violation of the 14th Amendment, which was, of course, the sort of installation of separate but equal into public schools. So that kind of comparison could work quite nicely between those two events. As for World War II, I think some key themes to explore here would be with the shortage, with the labour market shortage that the war brought, that afforded African Americans new opportunities in new employment opportunities, and that in turn led to improved relations with the US government. So some strong scope for discussion of that. World War II is a turning point there, and equally with the Birmingham Campaign of 1963, many historians would argue that this was a crucial event in leading to the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So again, plenty of scope for discussion and also plenty of historiographical analysis to be had with that event particularly. So when going about answering a question like this, I think it's important that we discuss how you would methodically evaluate the crux of this question, which is, of course, which is the most significant turning point. So the way I'd go about this is to set out some very definite criteria for evaluation, which can be applied to all four of these events. I think this is a good tactic for any sort of question like this that demands some sort of comparative evaluation. And so if I flick to the next screen, these are the criteria that I've come up with. So I'll go through them in turn. The first two go together, complement each other quite well: de jure advancements and de facto advancements. Now, these may be sort of new terms. So just to briefly explain, de jure advancements refers to the kind of legal advancements made. So with key pieces of legislation, such as the 1965 Voting Rights Act, that would be a de jure advancement on the face of it. De facto advancements, meanwhile, refer to those made in reality. So I suppose not all legislation will be sufficiently enforced for African Americans to see improvements in their everyday lives, despite the legislation having been passed. So that's kind of the discrepancy between the two. And a good way of appreciating how these two criteria could translate into some high-level analysis in this essay is in looking at the consequences of the Brown ruling. So on the one hand, kind of as I've just said, it's clearly, the Brown ruling is clearly a key de jure advancement. It on a legal level, overturned 70 years of racial segregation in public schools. However, when we look at whether that translates into improvements for African American students in the everyday, the results are far more disappointing. So, particularly in the Confederate states, i.e. those with the least progressive racial views and greatest racial tensions, we see that in the likes of North Carolina, for example, by 1960, only 34 out of 302,000 African American students in the state were attending mixed schools. And this kind of disappointing, underwhelming de facto impact of the Brown ruling is seen across those former Confederate states. So this is the kind of way that, thinking about these two criteria complements each other. It shows that you can appreciate that for a turning point to truly be significant, it can't just be on a legislative level, it needs to actually be on a more grassroots level as well. So turning to the second two criteria, looking at changes in white attitudes is important in two respects. Firstly, the US government throughout this period that we're talking about are predominantly white. So, their attitudes, changes in their attitudes are very important for African Americans, but also on a much more grassroots level. Most of the racial backlash and the everyday is seen just within society by African Americans and comes from everyday white citizens. So there needs to be, for a significant turning point, there needs to be change in white attitudes, both amongst government and amongst the population more widely. And it is useful to make this differentiation when thinking about this criteria in this essay. So, for example, when we look at World War II, on the one hand, we see the government increasingly recognising the value of African Americans in supporting the economy during the labour shortage of the war. This in turn leads to better relations, and this can also be seen in the passing of an executive order to end racial discrimination in the defence industries. So there was an improvement in racial labour relations, in racial relations between the government and African American workers. Meanwhile, you look at sort of more grassroots white attitudes, and what we see during the war is an upturn in race riots, racially motivated military mutinies, and lynchings, of course. So you have this juxtaposition between the two types of white attitudes, and this can also be seen in Brown as well, the aftermath of the Brown ruling. And then equally, black attitudes, changes in black attitudes are very important. I guess the way to think about this would be that for advancements like the 1965 Voting Rights Act, that was brought about as a direct consequence of Martin Luther King and the SCLC's activism. And Martin Luther King would have never been able to generate the support that he did for the Selma March, for example, without previous events improving how African Americans saw their own position and giving them the confidence to go on to fight for further rights, civil rights. So as I've kind of displayed with this table here, this is how I'd think about the analysis. Framing it with these criteria does help you with your research as well. So yeah, I think you could apply this technique to most essay titles requiring some sort of comparative evaluation such as this. And so just to mention now briefly, to get the full marks or the high marks with this coursework, you do need some strong historiographical analysis, and this can be quite tricky. But the way to think about it, we don't want to take historians' word as gospel always. Historians, as with everyone else, have their own biases, own prejudices, and people's opinions change over time. So I maybe think about critiquing historians in two ways, which I'll briefly discuss now. Firstly, you want to think about their biases. So an example of this we can see when we look at the historiography of the Birmingham campaign. It's a highly debated event in US civil rights history, particularly regarding whether it was a success, how much change it brought. One historian who's very firmly in the camp arguing that it was a unprecedented success is Diane McWhorter. But when you look into her background, we find that she actually has strong personal affiliations with this campaign. So, for example, she was the cousin of a man named Sidney Smyer, who was an influential anti-segregationist in Birmingham during the time of this campaign. So obviously she's not coming to the table with her opinion from a purely neutral standpoint there. The second way I'd think about critiquing opinions is through revisions in their opinions over time in historians' opinions. So on Brown, one of the key historians is Richard Kluger. So initially he wrote this big fat book about the events that was very highly thought of, and he wrote this in 1975. His opinion at this point was that Brown was this absolutely seminal legislative ruling for American civil rights advancement, and yet in 2001 he published a subsequent revision of his opinion, where he was responding to some new data about regression in racial integration in schools. And so when you're reading from the 1975 book, you think his opinion is firmly in the sort of pro-Brown being a great turning point school of thought, whereas actually if you need to make sure that you've got the most up-to-date opinions from these historians, and this is a good way to conduct some historiographical analysis. So I hope this helps, and have a good rest of your afternoon.